Okay, welcome everyone to the next session in the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Kayla Giordano. I am the Senior Strategic Initiatives Manager at the Partnership for Strong Communities. I'm also joined by my colleague, Dr. Samaila Adele, who's our Research and Policy Fellow here at the Partnership. The Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference theme this year is Here for Housing. And this is a really special annual event that allows us to collaborate, convene, and have conversations around creating systemic change in order to help expand the creation, affordability, choice, and stability of housing in Connecticut. So I'm really excited to be introducing the next session, which is on tenant organizing and control, pathways to housing stability. But before I hand it off to our presenter, we have a couple of folks that we need to thank. First is our presenting sponsor, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, as well as our visionary sponsor, Wells Fargo. Our champion sponsors, Robinson and Cole, Cohn Resnick, the Connecticut Department of Housing, J. D'Amelia and Associates, Trinity Financial, and Liberty Bank. We also have a group of amazing foundation sponsors, and all of these sponsors and their support help us to bring the conference to you year after year, free of charge, to make it accessible for everyone. Also, a special thanks to this session's investor sponsor, Navigate Affordable Housing Partners. Just a couple of last minute housekeeping things. These sessions are being recorded and will be made available as soon as possible on the partnership's YouTube page. In that vein, please keep your microphone muted unless you're called upon by one of our speakers to unmute yourselves. You can ask questions at the end via the chat. If anyone encounters any technical issues, you can send a message via the chat as well to myself or to Smilah, and we'll do our best to help you out. And finally, we would love to receive your feedback. So at the end of the session in the lobby, you can click on the microphone icon and leave us some feedback. We really appreciate you providing us with that feedback because it helps us improve the conference just year after year. And with that, I will hand it over to Luke.
Thank you, Kayla, and thank you to Partnership for Strong Communities for inviting me to present today. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Luke Milanakos Harrison. I'm the Union Vice President and Political Director for the Connecticut Tenants Union, a statewide organization of tenants organizing around the state of Connecticut in our cities and small towns, fighting for respect, dignity, stability, housing security, and a seat at the table. I've been able to do this organizing work for the past several years, my own organizing efforts and the organizing that eventually became Connecticut Tenants Union really emerged out of the pandemic and the intensification of the housing crisis felt, particularly by tenants during that time. And over the past several years have been just an incredible journey and sort of whirlwind of learning and building and creating and organizing with an incredibly wide array of diverse people across the state who share this conviction that tenants deserve more power over our own housing. We deserve greater stability and security and fairness and a fair chance at having a say in the forces that shape our lives and shape our housing, which is, as we all know, why we're all here today, foundational to everything about our lives and our communities. So that's a little bit about me and sort of how I come to this work. Before getting involved in tenant organizing, my background was in homeless services. I was a homeless outreach worker. So the nature of the housing crisis as truly a life or death issue when it gets to the end of the line and results in homelessness is extremely near and dear to me and motivates me every day in this work. Today, I'm going to be presenting about some of our organizing and what that has looked like in different parts of the state. And I'm going to zoom in on one particular story of a success story of tenants successfully maintaining their housing when the threat of losing it was dire and imminent. And then I'm going to talk about how that experience has put Connecticut Tenants Union and our members across the state on a path towards a more innovative approach to keeping folks housed, stemming the tide of housing insecurity and instability, and again, giving tenants a seat at that table and some more power and control over our own lives that I was speaking about before. So I'm going to start with big picture overview, zoom in on this particular story, and then talk about where that experience is leading us as an organization, and then close out with a kind of picture of where we're hoping to go in the next year or two. And I'm really looking forward to hopefully having some questions and conversation at the end. I haven't given this particular type of presentation before, so I'm really curious to know how it all hits you, or how it hits all of you, and what questions you have. So I will definitely be saving time at the end for a conversation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the presentation. Let me share my screen. This picture at the bottom is from our last membership convention a few months ago, which was a powerful event. And the first type of sort of formal membership convention following union convention norms that a tenant union has put on, that at least that we are aware of. We think we're the first ones to do it nationally, to run that kind of convention following the procedures of labor union conventions. So we were very proud of that event. And as you can see, just a lot of smiling faces, people who have kind of found their home in this movement. So like I said, I'm gonna sort of do an overview of the status quo that tenants are facing that has spurred a lot of the organizing, talk about the organizing, what that looks like, the story of the Blake Street Tenant Union, and the path that's put us on towards tenant-controlled housing. So I want to talk about the status quo that tenants are facing in Connecticut with a handful of particular stories of particular apartment complexes in lots of different parts of the state, rather than sort of high-level stats and research points, because that is a feature of tenant organizing and Connecticut Tenants Union. It is driven by real people with real stories. It's very grounded in personal experience. And so when we talk about the housing crisis, I think of these complexes. What all of these complexes share was that they were places of relative stability and affordability, where a lot of tenants had lived for a long time. In each of these buildings, there was an existing level of community, and neighbors knew each other, and the rents had not increased dramatically over time, and so people felt comfortable and sort of saw a future just staying in those same complexes, until a new owner, in every case by a sort of out-of-state investor entity who was looking to get in on the rental market in Connecticut, bought the place, and all of a sudden, almost overnight, everything changed for those tenants and their lives. What had been a place of stability and community and affordability was suddenly transformed into a situation of anxiety and dread and displacement. The Stonegate apartments were purchased by this company called Up Realty, which is kind of one of the big baddies. You'll see them several times on this slide because their business model is particularly predatory. They purchased Stonegate Apartments in 2022 and started issuing mass no-fault evictions to the hundreds of residents who lived there. Many people were displaced, including people who had lived there for 10 plus years. Representative Q. Williams got involved at the time, and as a result of that experience, introduced the first just cause bill that Connecticut had seen raised in many years. And I'll revisit that again at the end of the presentation, but just to say that he was personally so moved by what was going on at Stonegate that he introduced that legislation. It was a similar story at the Brookside Apartments, also purchased by Up Realty. I'm going to show a video from one of those tenants in a moment. but a long-standing community where people had lived for many years. The rent had not gone up over time more than, maybe $25 at a time. And all of a sudden it was purchased by Up Realty and mass no-fault evictions were received, and a stable community where people felt could envision a long-term future was sort of busted apart suddenly and dramatically, resulting in a lot of instability. Each of these other complexes, it's sort of a slightly different story, but same theme. Out-of-state investor comes in, buys the place, has built into their business model evictions and dramatic rent increases. And those experiences faced by so many tenants across the state have not been the only reason that tenants have started organizing, but they've been one of the most frequent. The feeling of being sort of invaded by, someone who has no sort of vested interest in the future of the community, upending people's lives suddenly with evictions and rent hikes, has just spurred a lot of the organizing in recent years. I didn't want to just show you the pictures of the apartment complexes without showing you also the people. These are just images taken from each of those complexes that were on the previous slide. So this is the status quo of tenants facing housing instability. Like I said, deferred maintenance, rent hikes, and evictions are built in as features and not bugs of this type of investment model. And without stronger tenant protection laws than what we currently have in Connecticut, if this trend is allowed to continue, we're going to be losing existing affordable rents at a faster pace than we're able to build new affordability restricted housing, which is one of the key reasons why reforming our zoning and increasing the supply of housing has to go hand in hand with stronger tenant protections, so that as much new affordable housing that we're adding, we're not losing more than we're able to add through evictions and rent hikes. A lack of control, power, and freedom are features of this type of experience of suddenly losing your long-term home because of someone else's investment schemes. And what the tenant union and what tenant organizing is able to do is challenge that type of authoritarian control over housing and therefore over people's lives, and pushing for negotiated power rather than unilateral power over the places that people live. And the premise is simply that if you get enough people together, tenants can have a voice, tenants can have some power too, and won't be simply kicked out at the whim of people who do not have their best interests at heart. So I've got these videos are sort of in rough draft form. We're going to keep working on them to use in our Just Cause campaign in 2025. But I wanted to show you this one from Sherry from the Brookside Apartments in Woodstock, because it just helps paint a picture of what tenants are going through and why they're choosing to organize.
So I've been here for 19 years, and this company bought this place. We didn't really know that it was being sold, so they gave us a year. So they pretty much left us alone, and then they sent out 5 eviction notices to the lady downstairs, the one in the middle and the one on the end, and a few in the houses in the house. They sent us an eviction notice in, I think it was January last year or this year, and go to the lawyer, find out, like, he had already told us the summer before. He's like, look, me specifically, he's like, they can't do anything to you, they can't kick you out. And he's like, if you just fight them, he's like, no judge in our area is gonna be like, oh yeah, sure, we'll let you kick these people out and so you can jack up the rents and increase the cost of living in our area, sure. And we found out that about Just Cause. I have MS, so I'm technically considered disabled, but a lot of the residents here were elderly. They were over 62, and we didn't know that there were laws that you can't evict them. It was a relief. I mean, and I was still worried that I might end up having to leave anyway, but I figured it's worth trying to fight for it because, I really like living here. And this place was, It was like I had a bunch of grandmas. I could go talk to all these ladies and know like anything. Like, hey, can you help me with this? They were a wealth of wisdom that I had living around me. I mean, I still have some of them, but I miss them. I'm here, Terry and Norma, Larry and Kathy, and Caroline downstairs in the front, and that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4 of us. If everybody had just cause, I mean, then they wouldn't have been able to do any of that. They say that in the state of Connecticut, a third of the state is renters. We can't have a third of our population with that kind of housing insecurity. I would recommend, if your landlord or your apartment complex gets sold like this was and they try to kick you out, fight them. Even if you're not covered by just cause, fight them. This place is being sold to a company that's saying that they are going to turn it into luxury apartments. They're taking affordable housing away from people and turning it into luxury housing and jacking up the cost of living. There's more humane ways, and they don't treat people like people. They treat us like we're just dollar signs. Like we're not, there's no humanity in it anymore. They don't care about that.
I want to show you Greg's story too. It's very powerful, but maybe if we have time at the end, I'll keep it moving for now. So I said at the beginning, I'll keep this brief, but Connecticut Tenants Union is just collectivizing these experiences of instability and injustice into a unified movement and unified organization where tenants who are leading in their own communities are leading the charge of this organization, what we're fighting for and how. Our board is tenant leaders who have organized in their own locations. And so fundamentally, we're accountable to a membership of tenants who is pushing for respect, dignity, and stability. And ultimately, community control, which I'll get to soon. So there's another apartment complex that wasn't on my original side, which sometimes called the Elizabeth Apartments. It's on Blake Street in New Haven, so we call it the Blake Street Tenant Union. That has been an exception to this rule. Similar to all of the other complexes mentioned before, it was a stable community where people had lived a long time with affordable rents. And then suddenly it was bought by a corporate investor who had different intentions for the complex that involved displacing almost everyone who lived there and dramatically raising the rents. But in this case, instead of a community being totally scattered and people being thrown into housing instability, because the tenant union was already there and therefore was able to organize and fight back in a strategic and unified way, tenants were able to negotiate for a collective bargaining agreement that moderated the rent increases significantly, took away the threat of no-fault eviction, and kept everybody in their homes at more affordable and manageable rent increases than what the new ownership originally proposed. So this story, the Blake Street story, has proven to us that there is an intervention that tenant unions can make in the crisis of housing and housing instability that so many tenants across the state are facing. So I want to walk you through a little bit about what that looked like, how we did it, how we brought the landlord to the table, and what we were able to win. So the 70-unit complex, people were paying between $900 and $1,100 for 1 and 2 bedroom apartments before the property was sold. And it was a very diverse cross-section of people, from folks living off of fixed income, Social Security, and disability, to people working lower wage job to middle wage jobs, some folks with union jobs. It was a very diverse community. It was bought by Ocean Management at the end of 2021, and tenants received very little communication from their new landlords for the better part of a year and a half after that. But there was one message sent to one tenant from management talking about a $450 rent increase, which was enough to spur the formation of a tenant union and a lot of communication amongst neighbors. In 2022, during this limbo period where there were new owners, but they were not communicating with the tenants, the tenant union sort of went public and tried to file complaints with the Fair Rent Commission. They were denied because it had only been a text and not an actual written offer. But that seemed to be enough to kind of hold Ocean Management at bay for the year of 2022, where people were just all left on month-to-month leases, so in a very insecure position, but not yet being evicted or facing a rent increase that would displace them. During that time is when we got the tenant union ordinance passed in the city of New Haven that gave tenants more standing with the city. Last year in 2023, after they'd owned the place, for a year and a half, they finally started calling about the rent increases that everybody feared from the beginning. And by that time, they had a tenant union on their hands. And so the neighbors who lived at this complex were able to sort of jump into action and mobilize around pressing the landlord to negotiate collectively for the rent increase and for all of the other issues that had become problematic at the property due to their pattern of deferred maintenance and negligence. And so that kind of kicked off the fight for the Blake Street Tenant Union, fighting to stay in their homes and not be displaced either by evictions or unaffordable rent increases. So last summer, this fight escalated in a lot of ways, and I won't walk you through each of these bullet points in too much detail, but in short, by organizing a high majority of tenants at this complex to move in lockstep and in a unified way, to exert public pressure, to use legal avenues, and to constantly press the landlord, the management company, Ocean Management, for collective bargaining. The union was able to bring Ocean Management to the bargaining table to sit down with an elected committee of leaders from this union of neighbors to negotiate for a moderated rent increase spread out over time, along with improved maintenance, communication, standards, things that tenants need and are paying for and we're not getting. The real standoff came after the first negotiating meeting between the union and Ocean Management. The landlord was apparently not too happy with the results of that meeting and wanted to use an intimidation tactic to get people to sign on to the 30% rent increase that was being proposed. So he issued a slew of no-fault evictions, and that kicked off one of the most intense weeks of my life personally, and for many of these residents, trying to push back against those evictions and fight back against them as retaliation for union organizing and negotiating. And like I said, it ramped up in a lot of ways. We were doing almost daily actions to fight back against those evictions, and eventually we were able to get them to rescind the evictions, come to the table, and negotiate for an agreement. Telling the story that way inherently glosses over a lot of the human experiences involved, the sleepless nights that people faced while they were, while the threat of eviction was hanging over their head. It was right when school started. So we had families with kids worrying about losing their housing right as they were going back to school, and multiple teachers in the union also who were trying to get lesson plans together and not spend time every single day fighting their eviction. But ultimately, it was successful, and I couldn't be more proud of these tenants who chose to stick together, stand up for themselves, and trust that they had power if it could be organized, which this experience proved. So in February of this year, after months of meetings and then months of written communications between our attorneys from New Haven, the New Haven legal assistants, so grateful for them, and Ocean's attorneys, we were able to hash out this memorandum of agreement, which stabilized rents from end of 2023 until 3 years later, 2026, and also raised a lot of the other addressed a lot of the other issues that tenants were raising around maintenance, badly needed repairs in the building, being able to get in touch with someone from the landlord company, etc. So this is, as far as we know, the first type of agreement signed between a tenant union and a landlord in the state. that we know of, and one of the first in the country, according to the research that we've been able to do. So this was a huge milestone for tenant organizing in Connecticut and the tenant union movement, and has proven to everyone, including including ourselves, that collective bargaining in the tenant landlord context is possible. It's powerful. It's a badly needed intervention into the status quo I was describing earlier. And there's something here. There's really some juice here, some power that is a big part of the reason why from, signing this agreement earlier this year until now, Connecticut Tenants Union has really grown every month, new tenant unions forming, because people have seen what Blake Street was able to accomplish and want to do the same for themselves and their neighbors. Now, what wasn't necessarily on our radar during this whole fight for a collective bargaining agreement around the rent from the new landlord was the idea that the property might change ownership yet again so quickly. Maybe that was on the back of our minds, but it was certainly not something that we were really focusing on. People were counting on having to deal with ocean management for the foreseeable future and just wanted to negotiate an agreement that would enable that relationship to be not completely antagonistic. But I will say that at least some of us, some members of the union, had the foresight to establish back in 2023 a social housing committee with the goal of just doing some research and building partnerships around a vision of community-controlled housing. And that committee was meeting and pulling resources together and having conversations, with it being sort of understood that it would be a far off goal sometime in the future. And then April of this year, we get notice that Ocean Management is putting the Blake Street complex up for sale. And again, that was a surprise, but we were really grateful that we had already established that committee to sort of be ready to think about, what does this mean? Are we going to be fighting off a new owner? Are they going to honor the relationship we've been able to establish with our current owner? Or is it going to be a battle all over again? Are they going to try to evict us all over again? Well, what's going to happen? There's so much anxiety and insecurity when a building is sold as a tenant. But as is the way of things in Connecticut Tenants Union, we decided to just go for it. And so we started, as soon as we found out the building was being sold, calling everyone we know and figuring out what would it look like to be able to buy this place and keep it under tenant control, rather than having this group of people be subjected once again to the whims of an unknown entity with unknown intentions. And that has resulted in a lot of new partnerships that we're really excited about, particularly with Home Inc., an affordable housing provider in New Haven, who we've, got to know just as a result of this situation, didn't have a prior relationship with, but through getting to know our work, getting to know the members of the Blake Street Tenant Union, and realizing how much power and potential there is in tenant organizing, Home Inc. has agreed to partner with Connecticut Tenants Union on trying to figure out how to buy this complex. And ultimately, negotiate a timeline for it in the preliminary stages being under Home Inc.'s ownership and management, but over time moving both of those over to the tenant union through establishing a governance structure, a cooperative governance structure, and also setting up our own community land trust. So that was, from that work of the social housing committee that I mentioned, has emerged as the vision for sort of permanently stable and affordable housing where tenants have a say, tenants have power over their own housing and their own lives, is through setting up a community land trust that can hold that land and steward it and govern it democratically as Blake Street and other complexes sort of get added to the overall community land trust. So let me flesh that out a little bit more. Here's what we're striving to do in acquiring the Blake Street property. We've acquired this acquisition partnership with Home Inc., which is, really, really exciting to think about what we can do together. So the goal is to, collaborate with them on putting in an offer and putting together the capital stack with the goal of having a joint stewardship relationship of the property for between 12 and 36 months. Again, with the ultimate goal being to transfer ownership from Home Inc. to the tenant union, establishing itself as a cooperative to manage the Blake Street property specifically, and then for that land to be placed into the Connecticut Tenants Union CLT, Community Land Trust. The Community Land Trust will then be established to provide the trainings and logistical support and technical expertise that the Blake Street Co-op will need to run a successful co-op and avoid some of the pitfalls that co-ops have sometimes faced, by giving them all of the sort of backing and support that they will need to be successful in managing that property. Very much similar to how Connecticut Tenants Union is structured currently, which is that each local tenant union at each apartment complex or building that is organized has an internal governance structure to make decisions democratically, but is also supported by the statewide Connecticut Tenants Union and provided with training and resources and lots of experience and expertise that we've accumulated over the years, so that it's not sort of a group of tenants left to go figure things out completely out on their own, but they're supported by a broader network of people with relevant expertise. So we're trying to replicate that structure of our union and apply it from, fighting, campaigning, and bargaining in the tenant landlord context into stewarding and governing land and housing directly through the Community Land Trust. So our vision is for community control. I started with the status quo, and you heard from Sherry Potter from that video about how the status quo is a total lack of control for tenants. If the building is sold and a new investor comes in and wants to double the rent, there's no legal limit currently for that being able to happen. And people's lives, homes, and longstanding communities are totally upended and lost. And it's just this feeling of powerlessness, anxiety, and lack of control that far too many tenants in this state are subjected to far too often. And so to address that, the question that we're asking and answering is, how can tenants have control over our own housing in, democratic organizations where residents of a complex have a say and have a way to negotiate with each other and with outside entities that are relevant players to have resident control, permanently affordable housing that's in a continuing relationship with the tenant union movement that is pushing the horizon of what's possible for tenants in our state. So what is a community land trust? It's an entity that can steward land, taking it off of the speculative real estate market and limiting resale values so that it can be held permanently affordable over the long term. The community land trust is the entity that actually owns the land and then preserves the affordability of the housing through restricted ground leases. So again, that would be a relationship between the community land trust and the co-op on site at the apartment complex. The CLT is governed by a board, typically a combination of residents and relevant stakeholders from the broader community. And here in Connecticut, we do have a variety of land trusts. Most of them are focused on conservation, but there are some small CLTs that have housing already. So our vision is to expand upon that work and make it truly a replicable model for the 21st century. So our vision is that the Community Land Trust will be statewide, just like the union, that it will be deeply tied to the tenant union, in governance and partnership, that the housing held within it will largely be limited equity co-ops at apartment complexes, larger multifamilies, that the community land trust will provide monitoring of those co-ops to make sure that they are, setting aside financial reserves and training new generations of leaders to govern the complex, et cetera. Will provide that kind of support and training, and will also hold partnerships with entities like Home Inc. and others that will be beneficial to all of the co-ops that are held within the CLT. That the CLT will be able to be that central body that gives each complex the support it needs to be sustainable. So that's our vision, is to move from tenant organizing and collective bargaining to tenant control and permanent stability, where people have ownership over their own homes. The two policy items that we have top of mind for us to help us get there on both fronts, to support the organizing and to support the control. The first is just cause eviction protection, which is what we're planning on fighting for hard in 2025, which will expand Connecticut's current law limiting no-fault evictions against certain subpopulations to cover more tenants in more types of buildings, so that more tenants cannot simply lose their home overnight with a notice on their door because there's been a change of ownership and for no other reason. Ending no-fault evictions will safeguard the right to organize by taking away the easiest tool of retaliation, and will build tenants' bargaining power by, taking that, like I said in the Blake Street story, Ocean Management used those retaliatory no-fault evictions to try to squash the negotiation process that the union was trying to engage in. If we can end no-fault evictions and require a just cause for evictions, tenants will have more leverage and be less at the whims of these predatory business models that build in rent hikes and evictions to their plans. So we're really hoping to pass that in 2025. And then funded TOPA. So TOPA stands for Tenant Opportunity to Purchase, which is essentially a right of first refusal if a property goes up for sale, requiring the first ability to make an offer on the property to go to the existing tenants who live there. TOPA exists in other parts of the US, but one thing that has sometimes held it back from being maximally impactful is that, as you can imagine, it can be very challenging for tenants to get the money together to make an offer on a place before an outside investor with deep pockets is able to do that. So what we would love to explore is an opportunity to both pass TOPA in Connecticut and also pair it with a tenant acquisition financing assistance, a way for tenants to get favorable loans in a rapid manner in order to be a viable and competitive buyer when those opportunities arise to use TOPA. At this point, we're sort of not planning a major campaign focused on this piece of legislation, but we are really trying to shop it around, get feedback, get ideas, and see if this is something that we could do in the next couple of years. Next steps for the union: continue the Blake Street story. So like I said, we have this partnership with Home Inc., but there's a lot that stands to happen between that and actually owning that complex. So we need to raise about $250,000 for the pre-development funding. We're working on that now. We want to expand our organizing capacity to give more tenants a chance to organize collectively with their neighbors and use their bargaining power to stay in their homes and keep their rents affordable. We're trying to do that by both raising member dues and solidarity dues for non-members to contribute to the work of the union. And in 2025, we're going to be working hard to expand Just Cause, working with partner organizations and endorsing organizations who understand that tenants having a say, tenants having a voice, and tenants being reckoned with as a political force is an absolutely central part of addressing the housing crisis in Connecticut. And that expanding Just Cause is a pivotal way to get more tenants more safety and security in organizing to protect their homes without the threat of a no-fault eviction hanging over their heads. That's about the end of my presentation, but before we go, I added this last slide because as usual, the work of the tenant union is nonstop, and we are currently right now in a situation in the city of Hartford with these tenants that you see here from an apartment complex called Concord Hills. Long story short, they were displaced by a fire that could have been prevented had the landlord been responsive, and have spent the past 3 months trying to figure out how they can get back into their homes that some were damaged by the fire, most were damaged by water damage and just some destructive behavior of contractors who are, I would say, destructive behavior of some entities, some people who burglarize their units in addition to them being displaced. So these folks have lost pretty much everything that they own and are fighting hard to get back into their apartments. Right now, there's a deadline of December 10th of the city of Hartford telling them that they're going to lose their temporary housing, regardless of whether the units are done by then. I added this slide because I just want to shout out if, a call to action right now for us would be to support the Concord Hills Tenant Union in their fight to get back into their homes, to hold the landlord accountable, and to not lose their temporary housing on December 10th simply because the landlord has failed to meet their deadlines. So I wanted to highlight this situation because it's so pressing and urgent right now. And if you've been following local news in Hartford, maybe you've seen it. This is very much ongoing. So with that, please get in touch, particularly if you want to get involved in that fight for the Concord Hills tenant unions, but also if you want to learn more about the union, get involved in the Just Cause campaign, or just talk to me about tenant organizing. I would love to communicate with any of you. Here's my info. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Luke. That was incredibly informative. I know I learned a lot. We have a couple minutes left, so are there anyone that might have a question? You can raise your hand, or feel free to put a question in the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom there. While we wait for folks to raise their hands or drop a question in the chat, I have one. To support the Concord Hills Tenant Union, what would you say is like the most important thing that someone could do to show their support?
Yeah, thanks. I think right now we're asking folks to give City Hall and Mayor Awilampulam a call and say, we support the Concord Hills tenants. The hotel stay needs to be extended until the units are ready. The tenants shouldn't lose their homes simply because the landlord has gotten away with failing to meet their deadlines from the city. So that would be the number one thing right now, would just be put in a call to his office and say, please extend the hotel stays and increase pressure on the landlord to actually do the repairs so people can go back home.
That's great. That's really helpful. Sometimes I feel like people don't know quite what to do. They want to support, but they don't know what the best action is. And even if you aren't a Hartford resident, we're all Connecticut residents. That's something that if anyone was in the legislative roundtable earlier today, that Representative Rojas said, just because you don't live in a community doesn't mean that you don't care about the people that live in that community. So we can all show our support.
Thanks, Kayla.
So here's a question from Lana. What would you say to folks who might argue that tenant unions may prevent future housing from being built?
I think I would say maybe a twofold response. One is that tenant unions are about tenants having respect, dignity, and a seat at the table. So if any sort of plans or schemes that we have to increase the supply of housing but doesn't think that those are valuable considerations, tenants having stability and a seat at the table, I would say then there's something wrong with our plans about how we're going to get to where we need to be with housing. Presumably, what we're all concerned about in the conversation around affordable housing is exactly that, making sure that tenants of all income levels have a safe place to live. Tenant unions are about organizing that interest into a representative body that can collectivize that demand. So any sidelining of the interests and the voice and the demands of the most impacted people, there's just something sort of fundamentally wrong about that premise. And secondly, I would say that, again, because tenant unions are about organizing tenants to organizing the political and the economic power of tenants, I think we're never going to get where we need to go with housing without that. Because how are we going to change the policies that affect us as tenants, and particularly that affect, the tenants who have been most left behind, marginalized, and oppressed by the current housing system? If their voice is not heard, I find it hard to believe that we're ever going to get where we need to be in terms of increasing the supply of affordable housing. I think there's only so much that good ideas and sound arguments can do without a movement and real political force behind it to get those things passed. So I think, anyone who's interested in increasing the amount of housing can understand why having tenants be organized and powerful is absolutely central to making that happen.
Thanks, Luke. Right, just about 3 minutes left. If there's any other questions, feel free to pop those in the chat. While we wait, I'll give a quick plug to the next round of sessions. So if you're interested in learning a little more about something that Luke was talking about during this session, community land trusts, at 3 o'clock, we have a session called Banding Together, Community Land Trusts and Housing, Co-ops for a Permanent Affordability. We also have a session on advancing racial equity in housing development, as well as a session on reducing discriminatory barriers using the Fair Housing Act to challenge local government opposition to affordable housing. So 3 more opportunities to learn from experts that have joined us here today. And I know it's hard to pick between sessions, so a reminder that all of these will be recorded and up on the partnership's YouTube page. So with that, it doesn't look like there's any other questions. Luke, if there's any last things that you want to say before we close out?
Just plug again, if anything about this interests you, please get in touch. We're sort of a scrappy band of tenant organizers and benefit a lot from partnerships that we're able to build at events like this. So we'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much, Luke, for coming and sharing your time and your expertise with everyone. I know I'll definitely be revisiting this recording, especially as session starts up. All right. Thank you, everyone.